911, what's the emergency?
My husband is face down in the bushes. I don't think he's breathing.
How would you characterize the violence of this murder?
It was a very brutal murder. There were multiple skull fractures caused by a hammer.
It was more than just a simple killing. It was a gruesome, cruel death.
It was just a loss of innocence. As you can see, I still haven't been able to let that go.
Was it possible that his murder was connected to his confidential work?
Yes, was this some type of espionage situation?
Anytime you learn that there's a potential lover, you want to look into that.
How would you describe where you were at that juncture of the investigation?
This is a huge piece of the puzzle. This is it. This is the break.
Hi, I'm Paula Zahn, and tonight we're on the case in Panama City, Florida. It was here in a quiet residential neighborhood that Dave Turenne, a devoted father and Canadian Air Force major, was savagely attacked after returning home from a routine errand. The mysterious clues surrounding his murder led investigators down a dark and twisted path filled with lies and betrayal. February 9th, 1996. It was just after 6 on a cool morning in Panama City, Florida, when police got a frantic call. 39-year-old Monique Turenne said she had found her husband lying unconscious on the ground outside of their home, and she feared the worst.
911, what's the emergency?
My husband is face down in the bushes. I don't think he's breathing.
Do you know what might have happened to him?
I don't know.
When detectives arrived minutes later, Monique was terrified. Steps away from the front door, police found 42-year-old Dave Turenne. There was no doubt that the major in the Canadian Air Force had lost his life during a savage attack. What did you see?
There was a lot of blood. A lot of blood.
Where was the blood located?
It was kind of pooling around his head area.
The severity of the injuries Dave had suffered left officers uncertain of how he had been killed. What do you think could have happened to him?
Was he beaten to death? Has he been shot? Had he been stabbed? You don't know.
How would you characterize the violence of this murder?
There were massive injuries, not only to the front of his face, but to the back of his head also. There was some defensive wounds. It was a very brutal murder.
More clues came into focus as police continued to process the crime scene. Did it look to you like he had been killed where he was attacked?
Oh, yes. You see all this cast-off blood, which was up 2 and 3 feet. It was on the bushes and the fence. So you know that there had been some type of altercation there.
Investigators questioned Dave's distraught wife. And the first thing she mentioned were the issues the couple had been having in their relationship. When you spoke with his wife, Monique, what did she tell you?
She was crying and sobbing, and we sat her down. She explained to us that their marriage was a little rocky, and that he slept in the guest bedroom.
Monique then composed herself and began to answer the detective's questions, laying out the timeline of events leading up to her finding her husband dead. Monique said they both had gone to bed early the night before. Did his wife say she heard anything unusual that night?
heard nothing. She had no idea what happened.
Were investigators surprised that no one inside of Monique's home heard the attack?
Not really. The bedroom that she'd be sleeping in was on the opposite side of the house.
In fact, Monique said she had been going about her normal routine for more than an hour that morning before she even began to suspect that something was wrong. What time did she say she woke up that morning?
She sets her alarm for 4:45 every morning, and his alarm is set for 5:45. She heard his alarm go off, and he didn't turn it off. And so she went in and looked in there, and he wasn't even in the bedroom.
Did she think it was strange that he wasn't in his bed that morning?
Oh, yes, and started looking for him. She walked through the house, couldn't find him.
Then Monique looked for her husband's car. Was it there?
It was in the driveway. She went out to look in the car, and when she turned around, that's how she found him.
Monique allowed police to search their home for clues. When investigators searched her home, did they find any evidence?
No, didn't find anything. We not only searched her home, we checked all around the yard, in the streets, on top of the house. We checked everywhere.
There was no evidence the attack had begun in the home or that the killer had entered it after murdering Dave.
A thorough search was conducted. Whoever was doing this attack would have had blood all over him or her.
However, detectives did see that both alarm clocks had been set to the times Monique had mentioned. Did her story seem credible?
It did.
Based on the blood evidence outside the home, police suspected that Dave had been ambushed somewhere between his car and the front door of his home. And when the medical examiner arrived, she helped confirm that theory. What were the medical examiner's conclusions?
The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be contusions to the brain. That was caused by multiple blunt force trauma to the head.
He had 13 skull fractures.
Could she determine what kind of weapon was used?
She said a hammer, probably a claw-type hammer.
Was the murder weapon ever found?
No, it was never found.
But the ME did discover a critical clue that advanced the investigation.
We went through his pockets, and we came up with a receipt from one of our local stores there, and it's time-stamped.
What was the timestamp on the receipt?
The timestamp was 2:14 in the morning.
How far away was the store from their house? Was it close?
Very close, mile.
The receipt placed Dave outside his home in the middle of the night. What time do you think the murder occurred?
We were placing it somewhere around 2:30 in the morning.
The most obvious explanation police could come up with was that Dave had been followed and his murder had been a random act of violence. But as detectives dug deeper into the Air Force major's life and work, several much darker potential motives came into focus. Panama City police were investigating the brutal murder of 42-year-old Dave Turenne. It appeared that the Canadian military officer had been savagely ambushed outside his home in the middle of the night. A receipt in his pocket showed that Dave had gone to a local drugstore at 2:14 that morning, and his body was found just after sunrise. But beyond that timeline, detectives had no idea about a potential motive for the crime. While investigators continued to narrow down their potential theories on the attack, Dave Turenne's sister, Pat, was in Canada trying to absorb the heartbreaking details. How did you even go about processing the news?
You just sort of go to another place, I guess. We just felt so wounded.
Dave's niece, Mary, was just 14 years old at the time.
I had never encountered anything like that, being that young. And it was just a loss of innocence.
For those closest to Dave, it was impossible to imagine that someone so full of life could have been taken from them in such a violent way. How would you describe your brother?
He was very generous. He was very family-oriented. He was very family-oriented.
What memories do you have of your Uncle David?
He was so funny. He could do voices and impressions, and he could tell these long jokes and just have everybody laughing.
But Dave also had a very serious side to him. The computer specialist in the Canadian military had been assigned to NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command at Tyndall Air Force Base.
He said it was a dream posting as a Canadian to be posted to Florida for 4 years.
Dave had already spent more than 3 years at Tyndall and was just months away from a new assignment. Were you aware that he had high security clearances?
Yes. I asked him once, and I said to him, "So what do you do down there in that bunker exactly?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, I can't exactly tell you."
Dave seemed to enjoy his top secret work, and on the surface, he and his wife appeared incredibly happy. How would you describe their relationship?
She seemed to be very nurturing of him, which I liked. She was quite vivacious. She was very friendly and outgoing. She was fun. She was caring. She was wonderful.
When Dave and Monique met, she had a son from a prior marriage. 3 years later, the couple had a child of their own. The terrifying tragedy meant that the young mother would now have to raise both children on her own. The shattered family Dave left behind only deepened the resolve of investigators on the case. And back at the crime scene, they focused on the grim story the blood evidence told about his desperate fight for survival. What were the blood spatter specialist's findings?
His head would have been at or on the ground when these massive wounds were being inflicted.
It was savage. It was more than just a simple killing. It was a gruesome, cruel death.
But why would anyone want to kill Dave Turenne? Robbery was ruled out as a motive. Nothing of value appeared to be missing. Not even the small amount of cash he had left after his purchase at the drugstore.
He had given the cashier a $10 bill, and he had $3.98 in change.
Did the receipt clearly specify what he bought?
He had purchased Tagamet as well as Midol.
Authorities were puzzled. The items he bought raised questions, and they were missing from the crime scene.
The medicine was never found.
Police went to the drugstore hoping to get answers to the mystery, but no one remembered seeing Dave. Still, investigators were confident that it was likely that the Air Force major had crossed paths with his killer within minutes of making the strange purchase. Did you think it was possible someone could have followed him home from the store?
That was a very real possibility.
Police were investigating the murder of Major Dave Turenne. The 42-year-old had been ambushed and killed in a vicious attack outside his own home. As police considered potential motives for the crime, two very different theories began to emerge. Had an odd purchase Dave had made in the middle of the night led him into harm's way? Or could the top-secret work he did at Tyndall Air Force Base have made Dave a target for murder? As police continued to sort through clues looking for the reason behind the crime, detectives were also searching for an eyewitness who might put them on the trail of Dave's killer.
We canvassed this whole neighborhood for 2 or 3 blocks around this crime scene, talking to everybody we could.
Could you find anyone
No.
who heard the struggle?
Nobody heard anything. They saw nothing.
This was a quiet neighborhood, upper middle-class homes, well-manicured yards. This was a suburban dream.
It was surprising that this type of brutal crime would have happened in that part of our town.
Investigators believed it was possible that Dave could have been targeted during a trip to the drugstore just a few miles away. His family said it wasn't the first time that Dave had gone out for medication in the middle of the night.
My mom had been there a couple of weeks earlier to visit, and she said he had gone out to buy some allergy medication in the night. And I thought, okay, so somebody followed him home. That's the only thing that made any sense to me.
Dave's wife, Monique, added traction to that theory. Why did Monique think her husband went to the store in the middle of the night?
He had indicated he was sick on his stomach before she went to bed, and that he probably got up to go to the store to get something for his stomach.
Police believe the purchase of Tagamet, a medicine used to treat heartburn, made sense. But they were surprised when Monique launched into an angry rant over the cause of Dave's stomach issues.
She stated that he was a drinker, used the word alcoholic.
And Monique went even further. She said Dave's excessive partying had led to many of the problems in their marriage.
She stated he would frequent the strip clubs there in the area, and he had a temper, a bad temper. Did not paint a real good picture of him.
Meanwhile, detectives also had to consider the possibility that Dave's work could have been the motive for the attack. Police visited Tyndall Air Force Base to talk with Dave's superior officers and colleagues. What did you learn about Major Turenne's work?
Major Turenne had worked out at Tyndall Air Force Base as part of NORAD. Basically, they defend all of North America against any enemies.
Officers wondered if something Dave had been working on might have put him in harm's way.
They do a lot of high security stuff out there at Tyndall.
So was there any thought that his work might have left him vulnerable?
Yes, was this some type of espionage situation where he got caught up and then was murdered as part of that?
Although Dave's work was sensitive, detectives learned it was unlikely that anything he had been doing would have been valuable to an international spy.
Once we talked to everybody out there at the Air Force Base, we ruled that out.
Could his coworkers think of anyone who would have had a reason to harm him?
No, nobody could come up with why this happened. Who would do this to him?
But those same conversations with Dave's coworkers raised some different concerns. Their description of Dave's personality and habits stood in stark contrast with his wife's. What did they tell you?
Just about the opposite about what she told us. He was very well liked. He was not an alcoholic. They said he didn't have a big, out-of-control temper.
No one other than Monique Turenne had mentioned the troubles Dave was having in his marriage either. Could he have managed to keep all his personal problems a secret? Or had his wife simply overstated them? Police weren't certain. How would you describe where you were at that juncture of the investigation?
We were nowhere. What have we missed here? Where do we go from here?
Then, just when detectives began to fear that the investigation might stall, an anonymous tip came in that sent the case in an entirely new direction. The investigation into the murder of Dave Turenne had taken Panama City police in some unusual directions. They had been forced to explore conflicting theories. The first was that Dave had been the victim of a random act of violence. The second related to his top-secret work. But then, an anonymous tip brought an intriguing new angle into focus. The call Panama City police received helped answer the tough questions they had about why Monique Turenne had portrayed her husband in such a negative light after his brutal murder. Monique was having an affair with another man.
The tipster stated Monique was romantically connected with one of her co-workers.
She strongly suggested that the police go interview other employees.
Monique Turenne had spent 2 years as a manager at a local building supply company. So your next step was going to the building supply office to talk with some of Monique's coworkers.
Correct.
What did you learn from them?
That she was romantically connected with Ralph Crompton.
40-year-old Ralph Crompton was a retired Air Force officer and a married father of 4. Still, investigators wondered if his affair with Monique could have been a motive for the murder. But when they looked into Crompton's whereabouts that night, the promising lead appeared to be a dead end. Ralph had been more than 800 miles away from the crime scene. Where was Ralph living at the time of the murder?
He was living in a hotel in Aiken, South Carolina.
Why was he living in a hotel?
He was working up there in a nuclear plant, and they had rented him a room.
Ralph didn't even have a car at his disposal. His employer said he was picked up and dropped off at the hotel each day. Still, Panama City police reached out to Detective Dwayne Courtney in South Carolina to make sure Crompton wasn't involved.
I basically just wanted to know, was there any way this guy could have gotten to Panama City?
Detective Courtney started his investigation by asking Crompton's employers if he had been at work on the day of the murder. It turned out he had called in sick that day.
Crompton had not been at work on February the 9th. He had told his employer that he thought he had the flu.
Detective Courtney's investigation gained more momentum when he spoke with the staff at the Holiday Inn where Crompton had been staying.
Mr. Crompton had left a note on his door to tell the cleaning crew not to come into his room. So all these red flags were popping up pretty quick.
Courtney continued to dig. He wondered if Crompton had traveled from Aiken to Panama City to murder Dave Turenne.
And if he did, how'd he do it? Well, obviously he had to either fly or rent a car.
When Detective Courtney relayed what he had discovered to his colleagues in Panama City, he didn't pull any punches.
Y'all need to head to Aiken.
Panama City investigators hit the road to make the long drive to Aiken. And by the time they arrived, Detective Courtney had found even more potentially incriminating evidence while talking with the owner of a local rental car agency.
I hit pay dirt with it.
Crompton had rented a car on February 8th, the day before the murder. What was going through your mind as he told you that?
He said, "This is it. This is what we've been waiting on. This is the break."
And there was more. The man who rented the car to Crompton remembered critical details about the transaction.
He also indicated that Mr. Crompton said that he was going to Savannah to visit a woman. He didn't want his wife to see that on a credit card, so he wanted to pay cash.
But the return records on the car that Crompton rented indicated he had driven a lot further than Savannah, Georgia.
He put over 900 miles on the car.
What did those mileage statistics tell you?
Ralph went to Panama City in that car. That's what it told us. This is a huge piece of the puzzle.
While Crompton's rental car was sent to the South Carolina State Police Lab for processing, detectives approached him at his hotel and asked if he would come to the station to answer some questions.
Monique's husband's been murdered. Somebody's killed him. Do you mind going to the police department? Yeah, let's go. I'll go.
As Detective Bates started the interview, he was careful not to tip his hand about the evidence he had compiled. Instead, he focused his questions on Crompton's romance with Monique. Did he admit to having a relationship with her?
No. Strictly a worker relationship.
Detective Bates then told Crompton that his former co-workers at the building supply office had told police everything.
So you've never had an affair with Monique, contrary to what people tell us.
Oh.
Why are they saying this?
Basically, we're lunch buddies, and that's about it.
But you've never had an affair with her, or there's never been anything between you, sex-wise, anything like that?
Detective Bates was now convinced that Crompton was lying, and it was likely to cover up his role in the murder of Dave Turenne. But the veteran investigator never could have imagined the impact of what Crompton would do next. Police investigating the murder of Major Dave Turenne had just zeroed in on a prime suspect. Detectives discovered that 40-year-old Ralph Crompton had been having an affair with Dave's wife, Monique. They had also uncovered evidence that Crompton had rented a car and driven to Panama City on the morning of the savage attack. Now, as the crime lab searched that car for physical evidence, they hoped that Crompton would reveal the truth in the interrogation room. During his interview with Ralph Crompton, Detective Dan Bates carefully allowed his subject to trap himself in lies.
Have you rented a car here in this town in the last 2 weeks?
Have I rented a car in the past 2 weeks? No.
Then, Bates confronted Crompton with what Detective Dwayne Courtney had discovered.
You rented a car.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't you lie to me?
Yeah, I think I'm going to plead the Fifth Amendment on this.
Crompton ended the interview seconds later.
He immediately shut down. Didn't want to talk.
Investigators obtained a sample of Crompton's DNA, but were forced to release him until a judge agreed to sign an arrest warrant. In the meantime, Detective Bates and South Carolina law enforcement kept Crompton on around-the-clock surveillance. The next morning, police obtained all the paperwork they needed to take Crompton into custody. But ultimately, had to force open the door at his hotel to make the arrest. When investigators went into his room, what did they see?
They found Ralph in the bathtub. Ralph had attempted to kill himself.
Was he still alive?
It wasn't really life-threatening. He had like a little penknife, and he'd cut his wrist.
Officers found a suicide note near his bed. Did Crompton say anything to the first responders?
Tell my wife and kids that I love them. Monique had nothing to do with this. I was trying to set her free. She was a modern-day slave.
To investigators, that statement was tantamount to a confession to killing Dave Turenne. Crompton was treated for his injuries at a nearby hospital. The next day, he was charged with first-degree murder and extradited back to Panama City. Meanwhile, across the border in Canada, investigator Lauren Schinkel tracked down Monique Turenne. Dave's wife had never returned to the United States after her husband's military funeral. Now investigators wanted to find out if she knew anything about her lover's role in the attack.
We needed to talk to her. She voluntarily agreed to come with us.
But almost immediately, Monique raised investigators' suspicions, denying her affair with Crompton, even after she was informed of his arrest.
It was kind of a cat and mouse game to try and pry that information out of her as the interview unfolded.
As the interrogation intensified, Monique admitted to having a sexual relationship with Crompton, and then she slowly began to share critical details that connected both Crompton and herself to Dave's murder. She claimed the original plan called for her to get Dave outside the house in the middle of the night. Monique said Ralph was going to rough up her husband after an argument she had with Dave. Did she admit to sending him to the store?
Yes, she did.
Monique said when Dave returned from the store, Crompton savagely attacked him, and the violent confrontation somehow escalated out of control.
She indicated that she stayed in the house and then received a call from Mr. Crompton saying that it went too far, that he's dead.
Monique said it was several hours before she worked up the courage to confirm what Crompton had told her.
She said that sometime later, she found her husband laying in a pool of blood with the injuries to his head.
Although Canadian authorities believed that Monique had played a far bigger role in the crime than she had admitted to, they had no choice but to take her home until her extradition to the United States could be negotiated. Just hours later, Monique Turenne attempted to take her own life. What was your reaction when you found out that Monique had also attempted suicide?
That was a big part of the puzzle. Got them both now.
While prosecutors began the process of having Monique Turenne returned to Florida, police in South Carolina completed the forensic examination of Ralph Crompton's rental car. What did the test results show?
There was blood on the inside of the car, and the DNA testing revealed that that was Ralph's as well as David Turenne's.
The small traces of blood appeared to seal Ralph Crompton's fate. But when his trial began, Crompton had one last surprise for prosecutors. He took the stand in his own defense and told the packed courtroom an entirely new story of how Dave Turenne was murdered. What was Crompton's defense during trial?
Crompton said that he and Monique had planned to have a one-night interlude while David slept just a few feet down the hall.
How did he explain that Dave ended up dead?
He indicated that he was supposed to knock on the back door and Monique would let him in. When he went there, Monique didn't open the door, and he was getting ready to leave when David Turenne came back from the store, and there was a confrontation.
So this was an unplanned confrontation?
Yes, there was a brief struggle where they were both throwing punches.
Crompton claimed at that point both he and Dave had only suffered a few cuts and bruises. Then, out of nowhere, someone came out of the shadows and attacked Dave with a hammer.
Someone hit David in the head and continued to beat him. That someone, according to Crompton, was Monique.
Prosecutors were stunned. Was that the first time he had ever accused Monique of murder?
That is the first time we ever heard that story.
Prosecutor Larry Bassford told the jury that Crompton's story simply didn't line up with the evidence recovered from the scene and his rental car.
We knew we had the forensic evidence that he did this.
What was your goal when you cross-examined Crompton?
To reveal to the jury that he could not be believed. He had lied so many times. He admitted that he would lie to his family. He would lie to his friends, his boss, the police. So we argued, if he will lie to them, then he wouldn't hesitate to lie to you.
So is it your belief that Ralph Crompton came to Dave's home that night to kill him?
Yes, it is. Ralph had everything planned down to the T.
But prosecutors believe there was one thing Ralph Crompton's plan didn't account for: police finding the car he rented to commit the crime. In the end, the jury found Crompton guilty of the murder of Major Dave Turenne. Describe to me the moment the verdict came down.
I felt sad for his sobbing children behind me, but I was relieved that the jury had found him guilty of first-degree murder.
With Crompton behind bars serving a life sentence, investigators zeroed in on Monique Turenne.
We've got one of them, and now we need to get the other one.
It would take 9 years before Monique was finally extradited back to Florida to stand trial. State Attorney Steve Meadows believed she deserved the same fate as Ralph Crompton. He charged Monique with first-degree murder.
This was a combined, orchestrated effort to take the life of David Turenne. And so whether he swung the hammer or she swung the hammer, they both swung the hammer when it came to taking his life.
Prosecutors presented the jury with several motives that Monique had for killing her husband. The 48-year-old loved Florida and didn't want to return to Canada when Dave's posting at Tyndall Air Force Base ended in a few short months. And then there was the affair, and of course, the money.
He was worth a significant amount of money to her. He had some life insurance policies and military benefits.
So there was a lot of money at stake here.
Yes, over $600,000.
Ralph Crompton refused to testify against Monique at trial, and she chose not to take the stand in her own defense. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jurors returned with their verdict. They found Monique Turenne guilty of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. At sentencing, Pat Turenne made certain that Monique heard about the pain and suffering she had caused. What were you trying to communicate in your victim's impact statement?
I wanted her and the court to know what she took from us. To think that somebody that you know that intimately has done this is such a betrayal.
The judge gave 48-year-old Monique Turenne the maximum possible sentence, 22 years in prison. Dave's family weren't the only ones outraged by the outcome. Ralph Crompton's loved ones believe she should have received the same punishment as he did.
I don't understand why she got second degree and why my dad got first degree. During my dad's trial, they placed the hammer in my father's hands. During her trial, they placed the hammer in her hand. There was only one person that swung that hammer. I want Monique just to find it in her heart to tell the truth.
Dave Turenne's family also hopes that one day they will know what really happened that night. It would close a painful chapter of their lives and help them begin to move past it.
He was a piece of our family, and it's missing. As you can see, I still haven't been able to let that go. It's just like it's yesterday. Like it's yesterday for me. It breaks my heart.
Major Dave Turenne's family continues to be outraged over Monique's sentence, and their disgust will only grow in the years to come. She's due for release in 2025. I'm Paula Zahn. Please join us next time when we're back on the case.